When I was a kid, I remember looking up the stars a lot, looking up at the night sky and thinking, what's it all about? And, it's just this tremendous sense of being alone. Sometimes, if I was honest, and fear, probably. But I remember thinking, what's it all about? And, it's an interesting question, really. Sometimes you just feel almost totally alone and almost quite bitter sometimes in life through different reasons. But it can be quite difficult to understand what's happening, but to even put it into words. After a while, we start thinking to ourselves, well, I need a bit more clarity here. Things need to come into perspective a little bit because it's kind of overwhelming sometimes. And it's interesting, really, but then really begins a bit of a journey, a bit of a spiritual quest towards maybe a bigger picture sometimes. And we have to get on with it, really. So we're just gonna go and move on, and as you do. It is time to go. It is time to. We're going to Munich, Dave and myself, and so we're at the point really where we're looking at around the kind of Second World War period, and it's interesting, but it makes you think of this whole thing of bitterness. Sometimes we have issues deep within our hearts that have never been resolved, and if you're not kind of careful, that can become, sometimes our outlook on life can become quite bitter, and it can spring up again. It's funny really, but First World War and Second World War both kind of sprang up in the same location in Europe, so we're looking at that, and then eventually we're going to look about resolving this thing of bitterness and where we turn to, really. So we've successfully been on our first journey, and it was in many ways we had to escape, quite literally, as you probably know. There was a volcano that erupted over Europe, so we literally had to do what we could to get out of Munich, and it made us both really think of escaping during that time of war, really, for what we can see in this area. And in terms again of the history of this course, then the whole kind of images turned into images of returning from war, really, and the destruction, particularly bomb damage, of places during the Second World War. as you can see, everything has been destroyed again, and it's funny, but there are times in life where sometimes we find ourselves in a situation and everything around us has kind of been destroyed in a way, and we're thinking, how did I get here, and what's going on, how did this happen? And very often it's about similar kind of issues. Something's not been resolved somewhere down the line, but we sort of say within ourselves, often we go, well, we can rebuild here, and we find it within us, to get up and start again, really. But if the issue's never been sorted out, and I'm talking about bitterness and really anger, and there's a hurt somewhere down the line, then if it's never really been dealt with, then we'll just really rebuild on top of that pain, and it'll spring up again somewhere down the line. So you can see that's kind of happened here, in this area, really. That's what the wars are often about. And we're hopefully, as I say, looking at getting this thing resolved. So it's funny, really, but people are really quite resilient, and we've sometimes, things happen and they make us think with a fresh kind of perspective and a new hope, and new things start to happen and flow out of the old kind of destruction in a way, but we're still kind of doing it in our own strength, is the point I'm trying to make, and we've still got to get this really dealt with. So what's been portrayed here is that something kind of new, a bit like a new flow that's something started, a new zest, a new hope, really, and in the midst of that, it's a bit like a stream flowing through life. But think of it another way, just in terms of the stream of society, really, that people are pulled along by. They're in the middle of the flow, so to speak, without sort of realising it. And what I've actually tried to portray here is that there are little specks of light. Even despite that, we're not totally overwhelmed, and sometimes it can be overwhelming by being sort of bombarded, really, by what everyone else is up to. Sometimes we're doing something slightly different, believing something different. There is beauty in the depths of the flow, despite sometimes how the flow might be quite overwhelming. God is very much in control and in the deepest place, as well as above the situation. But there is something is treasure. There is treasure to be had in deep places. sooner or later in life, very often we hit, to use the phrase, we hit the wall, as in something, an issue comes up that we just can't resolve really, and sends us into a bit of a state. And I'm just sort of been trying to portray here that the flow that's been going on has hit a kind of impenetrable situation, and at this point we've got a kind of choice to make really. And sometimes, you know, there are we kind of start going inwards on ourselves really, and we start discovering just the extent to which there is actually fractures and that run very deep in our hearts, in our lives. You know, the Bible talks about coming to God being in a way a bit like the mountain that Moses came to, and in Hebrews it says you've not come to that fearful place, Hebrews 12, but you know, so this picture really is portraying us coming to God, and the reality is that when we really do in our hearts, and the heart has, and you can see it really in this picture, the heart has deep fractures within, which hopefully I've kind of begun to portray, and that's the reality in hearts. We need healing, and very often we've been everywhere and we've had some wonderful, you know, things happen to us and thoughts and whatever, but still at the end of the day we need this fracture resolved and healed, and only God can do that. So we're still in that place, that deep place, and Psalm 18 talks about it's David cries out when he's in a similar need. Really, he says, "I love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust." And he says, "I'll call upon the Lord. He is worthy to be praised." He was very much in a situation of distress this time in his head. He called out to the Lord, and as you can see from this painting, the answer kind of comes in this case. It was God's deliverance came. The angel came down, pretty much like Gideon's story, came into the situation, into the depths of despair. God's answer comes. It's quite a dramatic kind of situation here, and it goes on to say that then the earth shook and it trembled, the foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken because he was wroth. There went up smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. So we kind of see that here God's really said enough's enough, and he's come down to help in this particular situation, in the very depths, and you can see it really is in the very depths. It was an interesting story in the newspaper about the miners in Chile who were trapped underground for quite a period of time. I thought it was a really good kind of picture really of how we can kind of find ourselves in that place sometimes, you know, and there's just no way out really, and you've got this tiny little confined space, but even within that little space, to be honest, then there is, and you can see it in this image I try to portray here, there is some kind of salvation, some kind of hope, some kind of deliverance, some kind of a bit of breathing space. I think it's important at this point to realise that those cracks which you mentioned earlier, if they're not kind of resolved and dealt with, then they become bigger, and division really comes in before you sort of know it really, and it's important to dwell on that concept here, because what I'm actually portrayed is when you're trapped in that place, there is actually a way out, but you can do it under your own strength still. But as you can see in this image here, there's still a lot of fractures going on in these characters really that are coming out of this, just like the Chilean miners had to get out of that place, but they had no way. So I think that really here we can introduce the concept of God's grace to us through Jesus coming down where we can't get out really, and that's exactly what he did. He came down and delivered us out of situations that we can't do ourselves. I think this image here shows you that finally these guys, the miners, they came out on the surface, and we've got an image here of hopefully capturing that to an extent. And so just in terms of the concept that we'll begin to introduce, it is we get delivered from where we're trapped when we really cry out from our hearts, and we find ourselves then relieved, but we have to kind of move forward. And it was interesting here, but the Chilean miners, because they've been in that dark place for so long, they all wore sunglasses, and they had to go forward. They had to kind of walk in the light, as it were, but with the sunglasses on, well, their eyes adjusted. So we're going to introduce in the next painting, the thing of walking forward. There's an interesting story in the Bible. Jesus talks about a man that was blind, and Jesus just said walk forward, really, and that was the kind of the tough period of time, if you like, which I portrayed in this image as a bit like walking in a war zone. You ain't really got a lot to go on, you're kind of walking blindly forward, and there's all kinds of sounds and voices around you, probably like the confusion of a war in a way. But eventually the guy was healed because he did walk forward as he was told to do, and we're going to go on later to introduce other concepts. There's interesting. I love the film, The Truman Show, because it kind of it talks about this guy who was kind of trapped in a situation which he thought was the norm, and then he comes out of that situation. It's a bit like that sometimes. We're kind of readjusting to a completely different truth from what we thought was the truth. And it's interesting, but there's a scene there where there's this guy who really was the director of the film in The Truman Show, and he was in what was a stage set of the moon, and he was talking to me, and he was saying, oh, Truman's about to get out of this stage, having crossed the water, and he's saying to him, well, you don't want to leave, do you? I've kept you here for years, you don't want to go, do you? And it's a bit like that. And the minute we're about to come out, you're hearing all these voices telling you to stay where you are, but you've got to keep moving forward until you discover true freedom and true truth, and no longer to be trapped in the situation that you were in. Just in terms of my love of films, I think also the film Star Wars, where the Death Star is blown to bits finally, and it's always kind of been there, no one's been able to deal with it, and it's that really to me is like a picture of what Jesus achieved, that when he died on the cross, he successfully destroyed the hold that death has upon us. So what we've got here is a guy that it's a bit like when we first really come to Jesus. It's kind of overwhelming, and here we got a guy. There's again a story in the Bible of a man who said his name was Legion because it said it had so many demons in him. When Jesus approached him, is what he said, and he ended up on his face before God. And when Saul, who had previously been persecuting Christians, is confronted on the Damascus road by Jesus, he ends up on the floor. And the Bible uses the words about God, that he is unapproachable light. And I'm trying to portray that in this image here. But also now, we're looking at, just after the film Star Wars, interestingly enough, the next one was The Empire Strikes Back. So it's almost like when that's been, does that hold, that stronghold has been destroyed, they've got as just a little bit of caution really as to, it's going to try and sometimes reassert itself. So we get bound up and enslaved again by the freedom that we've truly got in Christ. And it's interesting how that next film, Empire Strikes Back, is really about the Empire trying to reassert itself. And obviously the film in turn after this was Return of the Jedi. And they do actually rebuild a little bit, really, of the Death Star. So the stronghold, if you like, tries to reassert itself. And the Bible says, stand firm in the freedom that Christ has given you, and don't be burdened again. And, there's just this element of needing to stand firm in God, and He arms us and equips us, enables us to do that. And sometimes things and people come along and they try and reassert, burdens and slavery upon us, really, in terms of their own teaching and beliefs. We've come into what is a winter scene for a reason, because up until now the entire course has been about the dominance really of the mind and the heart really remaining quite frozen, quite numb, which is often the case. Our real pain is not even touched and we try and live through our head. So here we have a scene of winter, which is probably more like the state of the heart up to this point, and we're coming into a frozen place, really. The emotions are kind of frozen in that way. We need God's love through Jesus to melt these things, really. We need to come to Jesus like a child. That's what the Bible says. And here you can see a picture of a couple of kids who are skating really on a frozen kind of pond, a wintry kind of scene. It's a bit like that. We just have to be like children and trust and allow God's love. It's the love of God that leads us to change, and there's nothing harder than getting the heart to change. Really, we can change a lot of our mind and our actions and our ideas and beliefs, but it's the heart that needs to change, and the heart is really where the problem really lies. So we're really at the end of what we've been looking at, and what I really would love to conclude, if you read in the Bible where God speaks to different sort of prophets and various different people, and He said to them, what do you see? And they see a picture, really, and if they could paint, it really would be something quite impressive. So in a way we're sort of trying to portray some of those images, really, and argue that it's a very powerful teaching tool pictorially and visually, and but we want to actually now hopefully kind of think, well, what's God saying about our region? What's He saying about us? What does He want to show us? How does He want to show us? I personally think that visual is a very powerful area, is a very powerful way of portraying something that I just think we need in these days.